well, it's my great privilege to welcome this evening Professor Ken Miller, who's Professor of Cell Biology at Brown University in the USA. And as you may have gathered, Professor Miller has been very involved in science education, in general biology and education in particular, over these past years. Indeed, he's just telling me that his biology textbooks for undergraduates have sold 4 million copies, which is not bad. So if you were an undergraduate in the States, especially in other parts of the world, then Ken Miller's name is very familiar through spotting for biology exams and all that sort of thing. Last year, Professor Miller received the AAAS Public Understanding of Science and Technology Award in recognition of his work in communicating evolutionary science in North America. He's also been involved in the science-religion discussion, and we have a couple of Professor Miller's books on the bookstall. Perhaps the best known is Finding Darwin's God, which is now in its 28th printing, I gather, and has sold 100,000 copies. So it's doing well, but we've still got some more copies there for sale. And I do recommend that. It really is a very, very good book on this whole topic. And Professor Miller has also been quite prominent over these past few years in being a major critic of the intelligent design movement in the United States. And we'll be hearing more about that, I'm sure, this evening. So we're delighted he's going to speak to us tonight on God, Darwin, and design. Thank you, Professor Miller.
Dennis, thank you very much for that generous introduction. It's a great honor to be here. I've enjoyed a couple of days here in this beautiful city, in this great university, and I want to thank everyone I've interacted with, and I want to thank all of you for coming tonight, especially the Faraday Institute for making my trip over here possible. One never knows how one is going to be introduced, although I think you heard a quite fair and reasonable introduction. So I always bring my own slides so I can tell you who I really am, following the distortions of introduction. I'm actually a cellular biologist. I work on biological membrane structure and function. This is a photo of me in my very messy lab in Providence. I publish in journals like Cell. I used to edit the Journal of Cell Biology. And given a background like that, research interests like that, you might wonder, what is a nice cell biologist doing getting involved in issues related to evolution? Doesn't seem to have anything to do with it. Well, the answer is that if you allow a former student of yours to talk you into doing something absolutely ridiculous, you may get involved in it. And the thing that a former student of mine named Joseph Levine talked me into was going in with him and writing a biology textbook. And these are some of the editions of our various textbooks that have come out in the last few years. There was a slight inaccuracy in Dennis's introduction. These are actually used by high school students, not college students, for their first courses in biology in the US. These students are usually 14 or 15 years old, so this is the grade level at which they're introduced. And if you write such a book, you will very quickly discover that if it has a strong treatment of evolution, it becomes a point of controversy in certain of the United States, and that's one of the things that has drawn me into defending my own writing in these books about evolution. Now, I have to tell you, and again, one of these books or another is used probably in about 40 to 45% of the high school biology classes in the United States. And I've been blessed, not coincidentally, with two daughters. My oldest, Lauren, is a wildlife biologist, and she was lucky. Lauren was able to graduate from the high school in our town before our book was adopted by that high school, so she escaped. But my youngest daughter, Tracy, was not so lucky. And I live in a small town called Rehoboth, Massachusetts. It's only about 8,000 people. And for quite a few years, people in Rehoboth, a lot of them knew me, but not because of what I did for a living. They knew me because for almost 10 years, I was what you might call the commissioner of the girls' softball program in Rehoboth. And softball, of course, is the version of baseball that is played by girls and old, out-of-shape guys like me in the United States. So people knew Mr. Miller as the softball guy. I would run the spaghetti suppers to raise money for our youth leagues. I trained our umpires. In the summer, I used to coach one of our all-star teams. But they didn't really know what I did for a living until Dighton Rehoboth Regional High School, where my kids went to school, purchased copies of the book with the elephant on the cover for use in the classroom. My picture's inside. Suddenly my cover was blown. And you might think that it's very nice to have a book that you wrote being used in the community schools in your town. Well, maybe. One day, I was driving up to the high school to pick my daughter up, to pick up Tracy after field hockey practice. She was a very good field hockey player. And a woman I knew from softball, a fellow coach, flagged me down. Her name was Bonnie Kelly. Bonnie flagged me down and she said, "Ken, you wrote the book that they use in the high school now." And I smiled, and I got that big dumb look on your face that you get when you think someone is about to compliment you. And I puffed out my chest and I said, "Yes, Bonnie, I did." And she looked me straight in the eyes and she said, "Funny thing is, you don't seem that smart." And I was never quite sure how to take that. And my wife said, "Don't think about it very much, take it as a compliment." In any event, as Dennis was kind enough to say a few years ago, I wrote a book on evolution, defending evolution, and also pointing out the way in which religious people can understand it. That book is called Finding Darwin's God. It first came out in 1999. A lot has happened since then. And I wrote another book that came out this past year called Only a Theory, Evolution and the Battle for America's Soul. And probably it's fair to say that much of what I'm going to talk about tonight is really in this second book, Only a Theory. Now, I think you all know that evolution is an issue that divides Americans. And as an example of just how divisive it can be, Time magazine, a major news magazine in the United States, published a cover issue on this in the summer of 2005. And as you can see, they entitled it The Evolution Wars. They pointed out that many Americans, in fact, most of them in some states, reject the theory of evolution. They pointed out that our president at the time had taken a position on evolution that was not particularly helpful to the scientific community. Now, I hope you noticed something. I didn't pick this up at first, but my co-author spotted it in a flash. Look at whose textbook they superimposed President Bush's face on. Yes, that actually is our textbook. And I liked that at the time because we're always looking for new cover art for our textbook. And in a year or two, the state of Texas is going to be buying new biology books, and this just might be a winner for that state. So we'll see how that goes. But to illustrate how divisive this issue can be, over a space of 2 years, I actually testified in federal court under oath in trials on the teaching of evolution in 2 American states, Georgia and Pennsylvania. In Georgia, the issue was that one of the large counties had actually bought our book for all the high schools in the county, but then decided to paste warning stickers on each of the books to warn students that evolution was just a theory, not a fact. Don't take it too seriously. A trial ensued. Plaintiffs' parents in that school district argued that this was an attempt to promote religion, which is illegal under the American Constitution. I testified in that trial. We won. The stickers were eventually removed. But the more highly publicized trial came in Pennsylvania, where a very small school district called Dover actually passed a rule requiring the teachers to prepare a curriculum on something called intelligent design. More on that later. But besides those 2 trials, in the elections in our country in 2006, evolution was the issue in 2 statewide elections for state school boards, for state boards of education. And these 2 states were Ohio and Kansas. Now you might wonder, what does an election, because you may not have seen this in the UK, what does an election played out on the issue of evolution in the schools actually look like up close? So to help educate you in this respect, I brought a clipping from the largest newspaper in the state of Ohio, the Plain Dealer, about 10 days before the 2006 elections. You can see the headline, Evolution Debate at Center of State School Board Race. And what this article highlighted was the contest for one of the seats. The incumbent was really the leader of the anti-evolution forces on the board. She's actually a professor at Akron University in Ohio named Deborah Owens Fink, and she's very much anti-evolution. Her opponent for the same seat, a pro-science, pro-evolution candidate, had a very memorable name. It was Tom Sawyer. You can't miss this on the ballot. Now, what was the discourse like? What was the point of contention in this election? Here's what a talk show host, a radio talk show host, a very popular one, in Cleveland told his audience was at stake in the elections. He said, if you believe in God, creation, and true science, vote for Debbie. If you believe in evolution, abortion, and sin, vote for her opponent. And with rhetoric like that, you might wonder, how did the election turn out? Well, I'm proud to report that in the terms of this commentator, the sin vote emerged triumphant. And the reason for that is that pro-evolution candidates swept the State Board of Education elections in Ohio. And as it turns out, pro-evolution candidates also took control of the Kansas Board of Education. And the reason in both states was because scientists, educators, public health professionals, in Kansas, even the Association of Petroleum Geologists, formed organizations of citizens that were pro-science and advocated for science-friendly candidates in the election, and they managed to win both of them. And I've always felt, and I tell this to my scientific colleagues in the States, that Americans will choose science every time if we in the scientific community climb down from the ivory tower, get out on the street, and take the message of science to the public. And I think that's an important thing to do. Now, you might think this is sort of an exercise in sociology, because it's interesting to see what's happening on the other side of the pond. But I want to let you know that this does not happen just in the United States. Increasingly, this is an issue that divides Europeans as well. And there have been a number of interesting articles about this in The Economist, and also articles in Nature magazine. And here an article published in Nature about the anti-evolution movement in Europe was followed 2 weeks later by an anti-evolution letter to the editor, basically saying that evolution, really nothing has been proven, this is an open question. Now you might think, well, maybe this can happen in Europe, but surely nothing like this is going to happen in the UK. It's a big issue in Turkey. It has shown up on the continent in this way, and this is a quotation from a university professor on the European continent, but surely you might say nothing like this is ever going to happen in Britain, and certainly not here. Well, the reality is, any of you who have followed this in the UK knows is that's not exactly the case. Because it turns out, about 2 years ago, the BBC highlighted a program on the anti-evolution movement in the United States, and they thought it would be fun to poll Britons, to ask them the sort of questions that people in my country are always asked: which do you want to see taught in schools? Evolution, creationism, intelligent design, and fully 40% of Britons chose either creationism or intelligent design over evolution. Now, this poll was in 2006. More recently, it has been repeated, and again, as highlighted by the Daily Telegraph, indeed, it turns out the poll of the British public revealed severe doubts over the efficacy of Charles Darwin's theory of evolution to fully explain the complexity of life. Tomorrow, I'm going to be journeying up to Scotland, and as it turns out, this has also been a controversial issue in Scotland as well. And some of you may have known of an almost shameful incident at a natural science museum, natural history museum here in Britain, in which the organizers were so concerned about religious objections to an exhibit on evolution that they actually covered up offending sentences about evolution with some wrapping paper so that museum patrons didn't have to see them. So what I want to assure you about is that what I'm talking about is not confined to the United States, that intelligent design anti-evolutionism is another great American cultural export that is coming over to this side of the Atlantic as well, and I think those of us in the scientific community in the UK should be prepared for it. Now, what happened in this state of Pennsylvania is an instructive case. The school board in this small town, and it's always important to emphasize that education in the United States is a local function, much more so than it is in Europe, so local boards can exercise tremendous control over it. They voted to instruct their teachers to prepare a curriculum on intelligent design. The teachers, at the risk of losing their jobs, refused. This is to their everlasting credit. They said, this stuff isn't science. Nonetheless, what the board did was to vote to write its own lesson on intelligent design, and they had their professional employees go into the classrooms while the teachers literally stood outside in the hallway and read the intelligent design lesson to students. Well, what can you do in a circumstance like this? Well, in the United States, what can happen is that 11 parents of students went down to federal court at the nearest jurisdiction, which is Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, the state capital, and they filed a lawsuit. These are the citizens who did this. The lawsuit was known as Kitzmiller versus Dover, named after this unassuming woman in the blue blouse. Her name is Tammy Kitzmiller, and it alleged that their First Amendment rights as Americans not to have an agency of the state, and that's what a school board is, endorse a particular religious point of view had been violated. This lawsuit moved to trial with remarkable speed. Only about 9 months after filing, the case was called to order. And I'll tell you a little bit about the case in a second. But I think first we have to ask ourselves something. And that is, what does this term intelligent design actually mean? I think for the most part, I would say theists, people who believe in a God of any sort, maybe even deists, would agree that there is some sort of a transcendent intelligence behind existence. And you might actually express this as the notion that there is an intelligent design to the universe. And I want to tell you tonight, for what it's worth, that's actually a point of view that I hold myself. But that is not what is meant by intelligent design in this context. What is meant by intelligent design in this context is the proposition that what people call design, and what they really mean by that is outside intelligent intervention, is required to account for the origins of living things. And what this means is intelligent design is not this general consideration of meaning and purpose and value in the universe. It's a doctrine of special creation. When one says that complicated structures like the bacterial flagellum, or pathways like the proteins that clot our blood, were intelligently designed, what they actually mean is that the genes for these structures or pathways were created, in fact, by a creator. And that's why I call this a doctrine of special creation. Now, that doesn't mean it's wrong. It simply means that's the proper way to deal with it and to call it. Now, as the trial loomed, and the trial was called to order in September of 2005, for intelligent design proponents, this was their great chance. They drew, by the luck of the draw, and that's how it's done, a conservative judge that had recently been appointed to the bench by President George W. Bush. The judge, whose name is John E. Jones III, is a lifelong Republican, a judicial conservative. They thought, this is the case we can win, and all we have to do is to get those evil Darwinists on the stand under oath, and we'll break them down under cross-examination and get them to admit that evolution is just the tissue of lies. Well, you can see that cameras are not allowed in federal court. So when we have a trial in the US, any images are made by sketch artists. You can hear them scribbling away during the trial. And here is your representative Darwinist on the stand, that's me, in the NBC television courtroom sketch, being cross-examined by attorneys for the other side. And rather than something like this happening, what actually took place is that intelligent design literally fell apart during this 7-week trial as anything even remotely resembling a scientific theory. Now, I was actually the lead witness for the plaintiffs, for the evolution side in this trial. And my job was to take what you might call the icons of intelligent design, things like the bacterial flagellum or the blood clotting pathways, and basically show why the arguments used to say that these structures or pathways or genes are unevolvable, my job was to show that these arguments are incorrect. I knew that I would be followed by expert witnesses for the other side. So what I had to do basically was to explain the evidence for evolution. Then I had to tell the judge what these other witnesses would say about a week later, and then I had to explain to the judge in advance why what they were going to say was wrong. And as it took me 2 days on the stand to do it, including 6.5 hours of cross-examination under oath, but obviously I did it, and so did the other 5 expert witnesses for our side in this trial. But one of the things I want to review for you is the really persuasive evidence in this trial that intelligent design is in fact a religious idea. And here, I think the track record is exceptionally clear. The advocates of intelligent design say that students should be exposed to textbooks that describe what intelligent design is. One of those textbooks goes by the title of Pandas and People. And the content of this book turned out to be particularly persuasive. And I want to show you what I mean by that. Here from this book is the definition of intelligent design. And you can read it here for yourself. Intelligent design means that the various forms of life began abruptly through an intelligent agency with their distinctive features already intact. Fish with fins and scales, birds with feathers, beaks and wings, and so on. It sounds very scientific. I want to assure you that there's nothing in this book about Genesis, Jesus, the global flood. It sounds very scientific from cover to cover. Now, before the trial began, our attorneys had a bright idea. They subpoenaed the publishers of this book, and they asked them, Has this book ever been published earlier, perhaps under a different name? Do you have the earlier editions, editorial correspondence, page proofs, that sort of stuff? I thought this was absolutely pointless. As it turns out, they got 7,000 pages of material from the publisher. The lawyers went through it. One of the attorneys called me up one day and said, "Ken, here's what we found." He told me what they had found, and I practically fell to the floor laughing. All I could think of was, didn't these people learn anything from the Nixon administration? You can't leave this stuff around. You have to burn it. And what they should have burned was the fact that this book had been published earlier under a different name. And the differently named book, as you'll see, read paragraph for paragraph with this book, with one very interesting and very subtle exception. I want to show you the paragraph that matches this one. Creation means the various forms of life began abruptly through an intelligent creator. It's the same paragraph. And all they had done was to take the manuscript for this book called Biology and Origins, fire up Microsoft Word, do a find and replace. Find the word creator, replace it with the word designer, and pretend that now, because it calls the creator a designer, it's a non-religious book. Now, a colleague of mine from Louisiana, who also was an expert witness in the trial, named Barbara Forrest, went through this systematically. And her job was to dig through all 7,000 pages and count up the number of times they mentioned creation or creationism, that's in red, and the number of times they used the term design, that's in blue. And you can see that in the early versions of this book, it's all about creation, almost nothing about design. But watch this. Bang. All of a sudden, something happens. And what happens is in the middle of 1987, suddenly creation drops to zero and design goes up like a reciprocal plot to take its place. Clearly, something astonishing happened in 1987. Now, I was speaking at the University of North Carolina, great American State University, a few months ago. And I had been joking before the lecture to students in the front row that they looked like a pretty bright group. And they assured me that they were a very bright group. So I said, okay, you guys are so bright during the lecture. Tell me what happened, one of you, in 1987 to merit this change. And one young man started to wave his hands back and forth. I thought, this kid must know. So I said, okay, go ahead, what happened? And he jumped up and he turned to the whole audience and he said, "I was born." What do you say to that? I said, "Sir, I'm sure that was a remarkable event, but that's really not what I have in mind here. Here's what happened in 1987. This is a timeline of court cases in the United States that deal with the teaching of evolution in our schools. The very famous Scopes trial, the Scopes monkey trial in 1927 is all the way right over here, you can see it. The case involving the stickers in my textbook, Selman versus Cobb, is actually right here, but there's one really important case in this timeline. This is one that went to our Supreme Court. It was Edwards versus Aguillard, and it's the definitive case that identified creation science as inherently religious and therefore impermissible in the public schools in the United States. These folks had published a book on creation science. They wanted it to be put in the public schools, but suddenly the Supreme Court in '87 says, no, you can't. You can just imagine the panic that ensued among the publishers, the editors, and the authors. We can't sell this book. We can't call it creation science. So they brainstormed. Anybody got an idea? Got a name we can call it? And somebody puts their hand up and says, how about intelligent design? That's it. Microsoft Word, find and replace, call the creator designer, and you've got an intelligent design book. If anybody tells you that somehow the intelligent design movement, which you are seeing today in Britain, is any different from good old-fashioned creationism, remind them of how this intelligent design textbook came about. You take a book on creationism, you relabel it as intelligent design, and you pretend that it's something new. Now, what happened in this trial in Pennsylvania has already been documented for the British public. The BBC science series Horizon did a program about 3 years ago called A War on Science. And it talked about what happened in this town in Pennsylvania. They even went, besides the usual talking heads in this country, like Richard Attenborough and Richard Dawkins, they actually went over to the other side of the pond to find a few people like the advocates of intelligent design, this fellow up here named Bill Dembski, and a few people who disagreed with him, like this loudmouth biologist from Providence, Rhode Island. It was an interesting show, but I have to say, with a certain amount of American pride, that I think learning from this, the American science series, Nova, went to BBC one better. And they did a program about a year later, and I'm going to show you a lead clip from that program that will give you some idea of what was actually involved in this case. And here it is.
On Nova.
I believe there is an intelligent design. In the beginning, God created.
Saying that you don't believe in evolution is almost saying we don't believe that the Civil War ever took place in the United States.
An extraordinary court case ignites a small town.
It's like a civil war within the community, there's no question.
And puts science itself on trial.
Very important things were at stake. One is the future of science education in this country.
Nova reveals the story behind the headlines.
Anywhere you turn, we were getting attacked.
Witnesses started dropping like flies.
And probes the question, is intelligent design a scientific alternative to evolution?
Properly the subject of a science class.
Or religion in disguise?
It's a violation of everything we mean and everything we understand by science.
Judgment Day, intelligent design on trial on Nova.
I can see that obviously you think that voiceover was just dramatic enough. This was really an exceptional show, and it won the Peabody Award, which is an award for excellence in broadcast journalism. It's actually available as a DVD. This is sort of a commercial for public television in the US. And more importantly, if you actually care to watch this program, and I recommend it to you because it's really quite extraordinary, you can go to the Nova website and watch it at no charge with streaming video. So the entire program is up there, and I think it is indeed worth watching. Well, I haven't told you yet how the trial ended up. And what happened is just before Christmas in 2005, Judge Jones announced his decision as a result of this 7-week trial, and it was very clearly that intelligent design was not science. This was widely reported in the print media in the United States. It was reported, of course, in television, and it set off celebrations around the US in many respects. Now, I would love to pretend that with this confrontation, in which the intelligent design movement got to take their best shot at evolution, I'd love to pretend that this settled things, but it didn't. And that, in large measure, is why I wrote that book, Only a Theory, that was published in the middle of last year. And I made 3 points in that book. The first thing is this battle isn't over, and it certainly is, I think, just beginning, I'm afraid, in Europe. It's not so much about evolution. It really is a battle about the nature of scientific reason and whether it will be accepted. And I emphasize this point in particular to my colleagues in the physical sciences who figure, well, we always thought you biologists were a little flaky anyway, so we'll let you take care of this. This is actually a movement that seeks to undermine the authority of science across the board. And finally, I think it ultimately matters for our collective scientific future. It certainly matters in the United States, where I think this movement threatens to undermine the confidence in science in a whole generation of American young people. Now, I want to emphasize what the tactics of this movement are, because you'll see these tactics in the UK. And to be perfectly honest, weapon number one, and I don't mean to pull punches on this, is intentional distortion. And I want to show you an example of what I consider to be intentional distortion in that intelligent design textbook, Pandas and People. One of the arguments you will hear all the time, and you'll hear it in the UK too, is there's a problem with evolution. And that is that Charles Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection requires the existence of intermediate or transitional forms between species, and the fossil record does not provide them. Therefore, evolution is not supported by the fossil record. To make that claim, this book told 14 and 15-year-old students basically that evolutionists are so stupid that they actually believe that during the Devonian period, lobed fin fish like this Eusthenopteron gave rise to early amphibians like this Ichthyostega. And the reason they regard that as ridiculous is because how can anyone imagine that a lobed fin like this, with bones underneath, could suddenly and dramatically have changed its structure like this to produce a limb that was actually capable of supporting this animal out of water. And what they tell students is as follows. They ask them, how many different transitional species were required to bridge this gap? We don't know. But we do know that no such transitional species have ever been recovered. So in effect, what they're saying is that what evolutionists are doing is taking a line from fish to land vertebrates, and they've only got 2 examples on this line. Eusthenopteron, a fish that has certainly amphibian-like characteristics, but still very much a fish, and Ichthyostega, which is an amphibian, but it's an amphibian with some very remarkable fish-like characteristics, but they say there's no transitional species in between them. Now, even at the date this book was published, and it was published some years ago, that statement, there's no other word for it, that statement and that claim were false, because these specimens actually exist within the context of a very well understood evolutionary series, going from fish in the Devonian to early tetrapods. And it's worth noting that one of the major contributors to this knowledge, which was ignored by this book, is Jenny Clack, who happens to be here at Cambridge and is in the audience tonight. So this has to be, I don't know if Jenny, if you ever read this book, but it would have been infuriating to look at these pages because it bothered the heck out of me, among other things. But I want to go a little bit further tonight, beyond just showing that pandas deliberately ignored the scientific knowledge we had about this in order to distort the case for our students. And in reality, this so-called gap is actually part of a very well understood evolutionary transition. I want to go in a little closer. Let's look at one part of this transition. And in particular, I want to say, can we find yet another transitional form at what you might describe as the exact fish to amphibian transition between Panderichthys, a very amphibian-like fish with actually quite robust fins that probably could have supported part of the body of the fish out of the water, much the way that a mud skipper does today, and Acanthostega, an early tetrapod with distinctly fish-like characteristics. And I want to show you a clip of a colleague of Jenny's who actually led an expedition to try to find just such a transitional form. And here it is.
In 1999, paleontologist Neil Shubin and his colleagues set out to find just such a creature.
What evolution enables us to do is to make specific predictions about what we should find in the fossil record. The prediction in this case is clear-cut. That is, if we go to rocks of the right age and the rocks of the right type, we should find transitions between 2 great forms of life, between fish and amphibian.
Armed with this prediction, Shubin and his colleagues organized an expedition to one of the most desolate places on Earth, the Canadian Arctic, about 500 miles from the North Pole, where rocks of just the right age are exposed.
Money was running out. This was it. We were told this was our last show out there. And then in 2004, on the 3rd day of the season, a colleague of mine was removing rock and discovered a little snout sticking out the side of the cliff, just exactly like this. And he removed more rock, and more rock, and more rock, and it became clear this was a snout of a flat-headed animal. And that's when we knew, flat-headed animal at 375 million years old, this is going to be something interesting.
They called it Tiktaalik, which means large freshwater fish in the language of the local Inuit people. And it's one of the most vivid transitional fossils ever discovered, showing how land animals evolved from primitive fish.
Over here you have a fish about 380 million years old. And we see, just like any good fish, it has scales on its back and fins. You compare that to an amphibian, you find a creature that doesn't have scales, and it's modified the fins to become limbs, arms and legs, and the head's very different. It has a flat head with eyes on top and a neck. What we see when we look at the fossil record, at rocks of just the right age, there's a creature like Tiktaalik. Just like a fish, it has scales on its back and fins. You can see the fin webbing here. Again, when we look at the head, we see something very different. You see a very amphibian-like thing with a flat head with eyes on top. It gets even better when we take the fin apart. When we look inside the fin, as in this cast here, what you'll see is bones that compare to our shoulder, elbow, even parts of the wrist, bone for bone. So you have a fish at just the right time in the history of life that has characteristics of amphibians and primitive fish.
And to put it another way, you just couldn't draw it up any better if you wanted to on a drafting board to find an absolutely perfect intermediate form. And interestingly, it didn't stop there. because it turns out at about the same time another group had found yet another fossil in the same evolutionary transition. This one is called Goganathus. It's more on the fishy side, and if you look closely at the bony structure underneath his fins, you can see the bones that we can recognize as the humerus, the radius, the ulna, and many of the bones of the wrist as well. So I have a friend of mine named Colin Purrington, who teaches at Swarthmore College in the United States, a very distinguished liberal arts college. And even more so than me, Colin is a real wise guy. And he likes to point out that we already had a pretty good understanding of this transition. Then what happened in 2006 is Tiktaalik was published. It plugs in right here, Goganathus plugs right in there. And the way he put it is to tell me, because I have a reputation for arguing with these people, Ken, the next time you're involved in a controversy, a court case, a debate, or something like that, don't show a lot of slides. Don't talk about DNA sequences as you like to do and so forth. End it all with one sentence. And here's the sentence that Colin recommended. We have the fossils, we win. And I think that's a very good way to summarize the state of the current evidence. Now, some of you may wonder, why do these folks make such a big deal, such an argument against intermediate or transitional forms? I mean, who really cares where the first tetrapods came from? Why is this an important philosophical point? Well, the answer is it's not tetrapod origins that individuals are concerned about, it is human origins. And this is actually a billboard that appeared in the state of Kansas during those elections I was talking about in 2006. And you can probably go to this site now and see whoisyourcreator.com, and you will find that these were put up by people who find the very idea of evolution profoundly threatening. Now, what's the state of evidence here? What about this transition? Well, a few years ago, Nature published a new fossil find. There have been many since then, of this species over here, Kenyanthropus platyops, from East Africa. Here is a previous find, probably, it's some controversy, but is often classified as Homo habilis. And in the issue of Nature, in which this was reported, this chart was produced summarizing the extensive fossil evidence for our own ancestry in just the last 5 million years. And it's extraordinary to note that, contrary to what many people think, that there's some kind of missing link between us and our pre-human ancestors. In fact, we have so many missing links that we found that the hard part is to figure out how to connect the dots. We don't really know which ones were our direct ancestors, which ones were our cousins, which ones are the crazy uncle out in the cottage, or anything along those lines. That's the difficulty, not finding specimens. But I have to tell you something, because I find this significant. When I opened this issue of Nature and I looked at that graph, I thought, I've seen that. I've seen that exact graph somewhere before, but I couldn't place it. And then I went home that night and had dinner, and I thought, that's ridiculous. This is the latest, this is literally hot off the presses. How could I have seen that before? And I couldn't figure it out. 2 or 3 days later, I woke up, this is honest to truth, I woke up, got out of bed, walked into the shower, and thought, I know where I saw that before. When Charles Darwin published The Origin of Species in 1859, he put exactly one drawing in it. He wanted to show people what the origin of new species would look like if you had an absolutely complete fossil record. And he put a sketch in The Origin of Species, and this is part of the sketch. And it's right here. And the reason I thought I had seen this before is because our current understanding of human ancestry looks remarkably like the back of the envelope sketch that Charles Darwin 150 years ago put into The Origin of Species. The old guy got it right, and he got it right the very first time. Now, that still isn't as persuasive to many people as I think it ought to be scientifically. And a colleague of mine named Nicholas Matsky, who's now a graduate student at the University of California at Berkeley, suggested a way to make this clear. And Nick pointed out that there is a very dull paper that appeared in an obscure journal in which, just a couple years ago, in which the investigators took every single known pre-human specimen and measured the extant cranial capacity, the brain size in that specimen, and then basically listed it as a function of the geological age of the specimen. So here's all this scintillating data. It's just 16 pages of boring, boring, boring. But Nick knew there was something good in there. So what he did is something the author should have thought of. He took the data and he typed it into an Excel spreadsheet. He then graphed cranial capacity as a function of geologic age. And here's what he came up with. millions of years ago here, cranial capacity, and what you see, and it's color-coded by fossil species. What you see is a smooth transition up to the very same range of humans today. And to put it bluntly, do you see a gap between humans and non-human primates? And the answer is no, absolutely not. But here we have the advantage of numerical and statistical data that make this abundantly clear. Now, I'm not a paleontologist, so I find this data interesting, but it doesn't warm me up the way that molecular data does. 2 weeks before I was to take the stand in the Dover trial, this issue of Nature with the DNA sequence of the chimpanzee genome came out. I immediately realized this was significant. Here's a sentence from the summary article. More than a century ago, Darwin and Huxley proposed that we humans share recent common ancestors with the African great apes. Modern molecular studies have spectacularly confirmed this prediction, and indeed they had. But the problem with this is that in order to bring this into a courtroom, I couldn't get on the stand, and I couldn't talk, as some of these articles did, about the percent of conservation of synteny. I mean, the judge's eyes would have just glazed over. With no disrespect intended to anyone in the audience, we had to put this in terms so simple that even an attorney could understand it. And I want to show you how we did that. And these are slides that I actually used in the trial during the courtroom. We've known for a long time that we human beings share recent common ancestors with the other great apes, gorillas, orangutans, chimpanzees, and so forth. There's biogeography, fossil evidence, physiology, all sorts of good stuff. But here's something that's unusual, and remember I'm a cell biologist. We humans carry 46 pairs of chromosomes. Interestingly, all the other great apes carry 48. Now I know there are a lot of distinguished biologists in the room, and you realize that those 46 chromosomes are actually 2 sets of 23. Each of us got 23 chromosomes from mom and 23 from dad. A baby chimp gets 24 from mom and 24 from dad. So here's the question. Why are we missing a pair of chromosomes? Is it possible that in the lineage leading to us, a pair of chromosomes, just got trashed during meiosis or during fertilization, so they're no longer there? Well, the answer to that, as any primate geneticist will tell you, is no, it's not possible. The loss of both members of a homologous pair of chromosomes would be fatal. You wouldn't even get past gastrulation. Too many important genes. So there's only one possibility that is consistent with evolution. And that possibility is the 2 chromosomes that are still separate in other primates got accidentally stuck together in the lineage leading to us to fuse and form a single chromosome. And if that happened, it would drop us from 24 pairs down to 23. So that's the explanation. But here's why evolution is science and not conjecture. That evolutionary explanation leads to a testable prediction. Here's the testable prediction. That is that somewhere in our genome, we should carry a chromosome with evidence of having been formed by a recent fusion between 2 chromosomes that are still separate in other primates. And if we look at our genome and we don't find a chromosome like that, then the idea of common descent with other primates for our species is very much in doubt. But if we do find that kind of chromosome, that's a powerful and specific prediction made by the theory of evolutionary common ancestry, which we can confirm. Now, how would we find a chromosome like that? And again, if your field is not cell and molecular biology, you might wonder. It's actually pretty simple. What I've drawn up here are 2 chromosomes. The tips of each chromosomes are covered with a very special sequence of DNA called a telomere sequence. It's highly repetitive DNA. It is really easy to recognize, and it's only found at the tips. Near the center of every chromosome is an equally recognizable region known as the centromere. It's where the chromosome attaches to the mitotic spindle. If we carry today within us a chromosome that was formed by the fusion of 2 primate chromosomes, do you know what that chromosome should look like? It should have telomere DNA not only at the tips, but at the center, at the fusion point where it doesn't belong. And it should also have 2 centromeres. That should enable us to pick it out from any other chromosome in a flash. So the question is, do we indeed carry such a chromosome? Well, the answer is we do. It's called chromosome number 2. This is also a paper from 2005. Every detail that I have mentioned in human chromosome number 2, even the precise fusion site, which occurs in a 15-base region between bases 114,455,823, and another region 15 bases over is known, and it fits exactly this prediction. Is there any way that we could explain these facts? And these are facts. These are not hypothesis, theory, or conjecture. Is there any way to explain these facts in a way that's consistent with the view that our species was uniquely created or intelligently designed? The answer is no. There is only one way to explain them, and that's evolution. About the only other thing you could do would be to say maybe one day the designer wanted to fool us into thinking we had evolved, and he rigged chromosome number 2 in order to trick us. And the only thing I can say with respect to that is if that's what he wanted to do, he did a heck of a job, because the evidence of common ancestry is written all over our genome, and not just on this chromosome. Well, as I said, intentional distortion is weapon number 1. Weapon number 2 is a fear of evolution itself. And I thought this was brilliantly crystallized by a former senator from the state of Pennsylvania. And I chose him because, ironically, he is the senator who recommended Judge Jones for the bench, the guy who heard the Dover case and found in our favor. And Rick Santorum wrote a book a couple of years ago called It Takes a Family. And in that book, he took a shot at evolution. He said he didn't want to see evolution taught in our schools. He was asked about this by a reporter. The reporter said, "Why is evolution so important?" And he says, he means evolution, has huge consequences for society. I mean, it's where we come from. Does man have a purpose? Is there a purpose for our lives? Or are we, the result of chance? If we're the result of chance, if we're simply a mistake of nature, then that puts a different moral demand on us. And then he thought for a while and said, in fact, it doesn't put a moral demand on us, then if in fact we are a creation of a being that has moral demands. Well, the syntax is a little confused in there, but he was speaking without notes, so I'll cut him a little slack on that. But Santorum was saying that evolution tells us we're a mistake of nature, and if that's true, all morality, all sense of right and wrong is simply an illusion. If you really believe that to be true, I think that would be a profoundly threatening thing. And I think it's at the basis of what many people fear about evolution. So as a biologist, I want to ask the following question. Is evolution really driven by mistakes? Now, an awful lot of people, including biologists, would say, yes, of course it is. Because evolution is driven by mutations, which are mistakes that usually crop up in DNA replication or other processes associated with genetics. But that word mistake implies something that is not supposed to happen. So I want you to imagine the following. Imagine an organism that never made these mistakes. An organism like a microorganism here in which mutations never took place. If you have no mutations, you know what else you have? You have no evolution. You have no ability to adapt to changes in the environment. An organism that never made one of these so-called mistakes would not survive for very long. So we then have to ask ourselves the following. Maybe evolution isn't really a mistake of nature. Maybe organisms are actually selected for their ability to make what we call mistakes. So maybe evolution is actually an essential element of what we might call the design of nature. Now I want to continue on this theme in a very straightforward way. Santorum asked, doesn't evolution say that our lives are without meaning and purpose? And I would say as a scientist, does that mean we have to answer the intelligent design argument by claiming the obverse, namely that there is no design in nature? I don't think so, because that would imply that the form and function of living things, including ourselves, are the random and accidental mistakes of nature. And my message to you in closing tonight is they aren't. They aren't the random and accidental acts of nature. So I want to explain very specifically what I mean by that. The reality is that life is material. We live in a material world. I always cite this to my students as an example of one thing that Madonna got right. This really is a material world, and the capacity for life is built into the physics and chemistry of matter. Evolution, therefore, is an inherent and a predictable property of nature. It's not a mistake. It's more like a feature of nature. And what evolutionary processes do is they explore what biologists call adaptive space. And in so doing, they're driven by natural selection, which is distinctly non-random, and by natural law, which is not random either. What this means, essentially, is what I would call an evolutionary design to life is an inherent part of the fabric of the natural world. So here's my lesson, to especially my fellow biologists. This notion of design is not just something inspired by theology that we ought to simply dismiss. I think it's scientific reality, and we ought to embrace it. And the reason for that is I think ultimately what used to be called the argument from design is really, when we look at it today, an argument for evolution. And I want to explain exactly what I mean by that. Let's start with a classic. Does the human body have a design? Well, classically, advocates of intelligent design have really echoed the sentiments of the Reverend William Paley and his book, Natural Theology, in which he argued the human body does indeed have a design, and that design could only have come from the Creator. Well, I'm going to agree part of the way with William Paley. I'm going to say I think the human body does have a design, but I also want to tell you where it came from. And as an authority on this, I want to cite the person you saw in the video clip a few minutes ago, Neil Shubin. Neil has published last year a best-selling book in the United States. I'm sure it's becoming available in the UK, and it is called Your Inner Fish, a journey into the 3.5 billion year history of the human body. And what Neil argues is that the architecture, if you will, the design of the human body is the design of a fish body, and that you can understand peculiarities, and I'm not making these up, they're all in the book, peculiarities like nipples, hair, burping, as modifications of a fish physiology, which are now used by an organism that stands upright on land on what used to be its hind fins. And as it turns out, Neil also teaches human anatomy to medical students at the University of Chicago, and year after year he tells me he was struck more and more by the way in which you can understand human anatomy and physiology by virtue of its evolutionary ancestry in our fishy ancestors. This is a great book that will not only teach you a great deal of biology, but it'll make you laugh out loud in 10 or 15 places, and I think you'll enjoy it immensely. How about proteins? This is the sort of stuff that I work with from time to time. We often talk about the design of proteins, or an SH1 domain, or a GTP binding site. By design in that case, we mean the correlation between structure and function. Do proteins have a design? You bet they do. They have a design that has been produced in them by the process of evolution. Does the human genome, which we work on more and more in the laboratory and on computers, does the human genome have a design? And once again, I would agree that it does. But it's not the design of a draftsman writing that genome out in paper. It's the sort of design that you saw a few minutes ago that reflects our evolutionary common ancestry with other organisms. That common ancestry was anticipated, of course, by Charles Darwin in his second great book, The Descent of Man. And I have to tell you that one of my recurring fantasies is to meet Charles Darwin somewhere in the hereafter and tell him about the chromosome 2 story. And I can't believe that he wouldn't be smiling from ear to ear when he heard it. Now finally, I want to deal with an issue that comes up a lot when we talk about evolution. And I want to start off by saying, by re-underlining the point that I've said so far. And that is, I think the true design of life is real, but it's the evolutionary process. And it's the world of matter and energy that makes that evolutionary process possible. Here's where I see a reconciliation between both scientific and religious views of nature. I want to make this very clear how I see this. I would say that to religious people, to people of faith, the source of this order and design that I've been talking about in nature, and this is what science investigates, is really very clear. And that is, to them, it is ultimately God, because God is the source of everything natural. I would further say, to non-religious people, that order is still there, that evolutionary design is still real, but the order has to have another source. But here, to me, is the unifying principle. Either way, the study of that nature is exactly the same. And I think this is ultimately why science is compatible with faith. And that is ultimately whether a scientist is religious or non-religious, what really matters is the study of the order, the design, the architecture, and the function of the natural world. Many times when I speak in front of religious audiences, they get a little nervous about that. And I get questions all the time. Science is inherently materialistic. I have trouble believing in a discipline that is only materialistic in its outlook. And indeed, that's true. I think all scientists are methodological, if not philosophical, materialists. But I would argue that a science based on materialism doesn't have to be hostile to religious faith. It's not going to be confirmatory, but it doesn't have to be hostile. And I also think that religious faith doesn't have to be hostile to science. And to religious folks who are often skeptical about the role of materialism, I like to quote a tiny little sentence from Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis, and here it is: God likes matter, he invented it. And I think that's the ultimate justification for scientific materialism. If you're not a religious person and you find this a little bit too mystical, consider a very famous pronouncement about the nature of matter in the universe by a well-known atheist, and that is Carl Sagan, and that is, we humans are ultimately a way for the cosmos to know itself. And I think that has a cast of spirituality that I think even religious people can relate to, even coming from someone like Carl Sagan. But many people will say, but wait a minute, doesn't evolution actually say that God doesn't exist? And on the other side of the pond, this was not very highly publicized over the US, but I got to look at this, and boy did I find this funny, these little stickers on the side of London buses inspired by friends and colleagues of Richard Dawkins, and I like that. It says, there's probably no God. A lot of people are upset by the probably, saying, now stop worrying and enjoy your life. And I was amused by that to find out that apparently only religious people worry. And of course, if you wanted to export that slogan to the US, you would have to say, there's probably no God, so party on, dude. And that would be a good translation of what's going on. But I want to point something out, and that is that scientific opinion on this is hardly unanimous. The new magazine called BBC Knowledge, in one of its early issues this year, did a really penetrating interview with Richard Dawkins. It's really quite good. And then they asked two people to comment on the following proposition: is the theory of evolution compatible with divine creation? So they decided to go over to the other side of the pond, and they asked an American philosopher of science, Daniel Dennett at Tufts University in the Boston area, about this, and Dennett said no, it's absolutely not compatible with this, but as long as they were over on the other side of the pond, they figured they'd find another American who disagreed with Dennett, and guess who they picked? Yeah, that would be me. And basically I said, yes, it is. And if you're interested in this, you can go online, pick up the magazine, and see the 2 points of view. But I would also point out that about 40% of working scientists in the United States, in the AAAS, American Association for the Advancement of Science, are in fact people of faith. So I think it is self-evident that people can do science, and they do it quite brilliantly, and still be religious. And I think that's self-evident simply from statistics. There also, this month, is a very interesting BBC program hosted by the gentleman you see up here, dealing with the central idea of whether or not one can be a Christian and in fact accept the theory of evolution. And if you've seen this program, you know that the thesis of the program is yes, you can. What about very famous pronouncements by people like Richard Dawkins saying, here's what science tells us? And Richard must like this quote because he actually put the same wording in 2 of his books. The universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, and no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. Now, I can't tell you how many times in the US that quote has been thrown at me as saying that's why I dislike evolution, because of the bleak worldview that it evidently requires. Well, I look at that statement, and I know, because I do know Richard, and I have spoken with him about this, that that is indeed exactly what he believes, even though he once wrote a marvelous book called Unweaving the Rainbow, in which he mentioned this quote, and said that he'd written Unweaving the Rainbow in part to let people know that he's actually a rather pleasant, happy, and optimistic fellow, despite this particular quotation. But the interesting thing about this is, from my point of view, comes from the following analysis. Is that a scientific statement? It's certainly a statement by a scientist, but is it a scientific statement? And in particular, I began to wonder, what would other scientists and other people who have also written about evolution say? How about, for example, John Haught, who was one of my fellow expert witnesses at the Dover trial, a theologian. at Georgetown University, a Catholic university in the States, who has argued persuasively, I think, that Catholic theology is consistent with evolution, or a great molecular biologist like Francis Collins, responsible for heading the Human Genome Project worldwide, that led to the sequencing of this, or great geneticists like Theodosius Dobzhansky or Francisco Ayala. I think they might look at the same data that Dawkins looks at when he says this, and they might say something a little bit more like this. They might say the universe we observe has precisely the properties we might expect from the wisdom of a provident and purposeful God, intent upon a fruitful and dynamic world, and committed to a promise of freedom that makes genuine love possible. And I've actually bounced this wording off to those people, and they pretty much agreed with me that it is something they would like to say. Now you might say, wait a minute, that's not a scientific statement, and you know what? I agree 100%. That is not a scientific statement, but it is no less a scientific statement than what you heard from Richard Dawkins. It's a philosophical conclusion informed by science about which I think reasonable people can differ. Francis Collins articulated his point of view, this point of view in his marvelous book, The Language of God. Carl Giberson, a physicist in the States, has written a book called Saving Darwin, making much the same point. There's a book called Thank God for Evolution by my guy named Michael Dowd, and this is also a point of view that I articulated in my own book. So the point I want to make here is simple, and that is a claim of ultimate purpose can in fact be perfectly consistent with scientific reality, not confirmed by scientific reality, certainly not scientific, but consistent with scientific reality. And as an example, I'd like to bring up probably the greatest evolutionary population geneticist of the 20th century, Theodosius Dobzhansky, in a very famous article that biology instructors around the world know. In 1973, he famously wrote that nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. It's absolutely true. It's almost a credo for those of us who work in biology. But in the very same article, look at what Dobzhansky wrote. The organic diversity of life is understandable if the Creator made the living world not by caprice, I would say not by intelligent design, but by evolution propelled by natural selection. Then he said, it's wrong to hold creation and evolution as mutually exclusive alternatives. I, Dobzhansky, am a creationist and an evolutionist. Now how can he say that? He says because evolution to him is God or nature's method of creation. Creation is not an event that happened in 4000 BC. It's a process that began 10 billion years ago and is still underway today. Now, to go to a somewhat higher authority than Dobzhansky, you might go to Pope Benedict, and you can see a headline from a recent statement of his, Creation versus Evolution Clash an Absurdity. And what the Pope actually said a couple years ago, this contrast is an absurdity because there are many scientific tests in favor of evolution that appears as a reality we must see and enriches our understanding of life and being. Well, we Americans like things shorter and sweeter, and if you'd like something shorter and sweeter, you can always go to one of our popular newspapers, the New York Post, and the New York Post has a nice way of putting things, and they said, evolution and God do mix, Pope. And that's a pretty straightforward statement about this. And I would add that the same sentiment has been echoed in somewhat more elegant fashion by a clergyman over here in Great Britain, and in this particular case, this is by Cormac Murphy O'Connor, one of the cardinals in the United Kingdom. And you might be wondering at this point, is this guy saying somehow that the Bible should be read as a scientific textbook? The answer is, of course not. But I want to let you know I'm not the first person to say that. And I want to call your attention to an incredible book written at the beginning of the 5th century by St. Augustine, one of the earliest and most prolific of all the Christian writers. He's writing about the book of Genesis. Now you can read the words up here because they're in big type. And as you read them, I'm going to translate them on the fly into what I think is 21st century English. Even a non-believer, according to Augustine, can study geology, astronomy, zoology, botany, and other scientific fields, and can gain scientific knowledge from observation and experiment. Now, the worst thing that could happen would be for a non-believer to hear a Christian explaining the Bible, talking nonsense on these scientific topics. We Christians have to do everything we can to prevent the embarrassment of non-believers showing up scientific ignorance in a Christian and laughing it to scorn. Augustine was warning people. He wasn't concerned about Darwin or evolution. He was warning people at the beginning of the 5th century. Don't read Genesis as a scientific text, because if you do, and you are mistaken, the non-believer will disregard the real message of Scripture, which to him, of course, is the message of salvation. Now, once when I showed this quote to a group of geneticists, a person raised his hand and said, what kind of science would we get if we follow the ideas of a weird 5th century mystic like Augustine? And that's a likeness of Augustine. I think it's a good question. It's a fair question. So I said, let me answer it with an example of a particular individual who was so influenced by Augustine's thought that he joined a religious order founded according to the precepts of St. Augustine. He was quite successful in that religious order. His colleagues thought very highly of him, and eventually they made him the abbot of the Augustinian monastery of St. Thomas in Brunn, in what is today the Czech Republic. Now, at one point in his life, this devout clergyman got interested in what today we would call a scientific question. And he decided to read Scripture, he read it every day. To pray, he prayed every day. But to answer the scientific question, what he did was to go into his garden and do experiments. That Augustinian priest was Gregor Mendel, the founder of the modern science of genetics. What kind of science do you get if you follow Augustinian precepts? Answer, you get darn good science, you get genetics. And I think that's a profound statement about the ultimate compatibility, again, of science and religion. So who summarizes it best? Sometimes I'm asked by people, how do you see evolution? And I have to tell you, I like to use my own words. I take some pride in being able to write with a small amount of skill. But I have to say, when someone asks me that question, I always say, I'm sorry, I'm going to steal the words of somebody else. And I'm going to steal it of somebody who wrote these words a century and a half ago. This person, when summarizing his own views of evolution, didn't say that he thought evolution was depressing or demeaning or demoralizing in some way. This is the same person who kept this page in his notebook, a page that many of you probably have seen. I saw it myself with my own eyes for the very first time a year and a half ago at the American Museum of Natural History in New York, and it just sent chills down my spine to see the words, I think, and to see this sketch in this guy's own hands, the very first sketch of this kind ever written down anywhere. And at the end of a famous book that you've all heard about, he said, I think there is grandeur in this view of life, with its several powers having been originally breathed into a few forms or into one, and that while this planet has gone cycling on according to the fixed law of gravity, from so simple a beginning, endless forms, most wonderful and most beautiful, have been and are being evolved. Those are the concluding words, the last sentence of The Origin of Species by Charles Darwin, and I think those are words to live by. Thank you all very much.
Just one or two questions. We're running a little over, but it would be good to get a few questions and comments from the floor. Please, over to you. If you can keep your questions brief, that would be helpful. Thank you. Anybody? Yes, question Bill here.
More recently, proponents of ID have been couching their theory in terms of kind of intellectual freedom and trying again to get it in. I was just wondering if you could tell us just how successful they've been.
That's a good question. And the point that you make is proponents of ID have actually dropped the use of the word ID. And instead they've introduced in several American states, in our state legislatures, bills they call academic freedom bills. And they allegedly give teachers and students the freedom to question evolution and assure that they will not be sued, they will not be fired, they will not be disciplined, and so forth. Well, I'm in favor of academic freedom. I think academic freedom is a great thing. And I think teachers should be able to discuss anything they want freely with their students. And I think students should be able to question not just evolution, but everything from the capitalist system and democracy all the way down to the labor theory of capital. I think all of these are good things for people to question. But here's the issue, really. And that is whether or not under the guise of academic freedom, patently false information will be protected when it is brought into the science classroom, basically for propaganda purposes. And I'm deeply concerned about that. A bill of this sort has failed in Florida. A bill of this sort was voted down in New Mexico. A bill of this sort was rejected by the legislature in Kansas, but a bill of this sort was signed into law by the governor of the state of Louisiana. It is now the law in that state. Now, those of us concerned about this are waiting to see what happens in terms of what materials are brought into the classroom under the guise of academic freedom, and we're deeply concerned about this. I'm also not proud to say that the governor of Louisiana, whose name is Bobby Jindal, is a graduate of my own university, Brown University, and in fact was a biology concentrator at the university, though I'm also quick to say I didn't teach him. He wasn't in any of my courses. I should also point out for those of you, and I saw a few smug smiles when I said that the governor had graduated from my university, the leader of the Discovery Institute, which is the organization based in Washington State that advocates for intelligent design, is Stephen C. Meyer, who holds a PhD in the history and philosophy of science from Cambridge University. So no one's educational hands are clean. But this is indeed the new strategy. People have seen through it in several states, but in at least one state so far it's been successful, and I am concerned about it.
Yes, sir. Christopher. Yes.
Would you accept that? Would you accept that there's a great deal of cruelty and suffering built into the need to survive through evolution? And
of course I would accept that. How could anyone say anything
How do you live with a God who set that in motion?
Well, I think the answer to that, and this is actually an objection to the theory of evolution that one often hears from creationists, which is to say that the evolutionary cruelty of the struggle for existence, the survival of the fittest, is simply not compatible with a God, and therefore they're going to reject the whole idea of evolution. All that evolution says, and I'm always quick to point this out to religious people who make this objection. I don't think that's where you're coming from, but I point this out to religious people, is that all that natural selection says is that everything that has ever been born will eventually die. And I read a book once that had a phrase in it that said, "Remember, man, thou art dust, and to dust thou shalt return." It says the same thing. Darwin didn't write that book. Somebody else wrote that book. So the reality of death is out there. To those people coming from the other side of the argument, who say, how can you believe in God when nature is so cruel? I often ask them something very simple. Explain to me how you design a material world in which there is no death and there is no suffering. Because it turns out, if you design an existence in which we are creatures of matter and yet there is no death, you also make that world static, fixed, and unchangeable. Because in effect, you're saying that creatures will be immortalized. And with immortality comes the absence of any possibility for change, of any possibility for perfection, of any possibility for evolution per se. And I would argue that the panorama of evolution, with all the cruelty and suffering that we all know about in other organisms and even in our own lives, I would argue that that really is where the beauty and the extravagance and the creativity of life comes from. So I am skeptical of the notion that people who say existence is too cruel to allow for the existence of a creator have really thought carefully as to how you would design a material existence in which that was not a possibility and still preserve the beauty and, the, as I say, the extravagant creativity of life that we see in the world. So that's the way I see it.
Time for one more question. Yes, please. Yeah.
With reference to your last statement,
Yes.
isn't the landscape of Mars a world without death? There is no life, but it is still dynamic and changing due to the weather patterns and other events that occur there?
I'm going to ask you a personal question, sir. Are you a geologist?
No.
Oh, okay. To me, the landscape of Mars is only exciting if one is a geologist, and I think there's a great deal of geological interest. Please don't take that the wrong way. Some of my best friends are geologists, as they often say. But I would put to you the following question, and that is that sooner or later, the European space program, the Americans, the Russians, somebody's going to get to Mars, do some really good exploration. I really hope it happens in my lifetime. I think the single most exciting thing that we could discover on Mars or any other planet would be some form of life. I mean, I think that would be astonishing. And therefore, I really regard, and this is my own personal prejudice as a biologist as opposed to a geologist, I regard life as the single most interesting thing in the universe. And therefore, to me, Mars is not nearly as interesting without life as it could be with life.
Great, we could carry on, I know, for a very long time, but I think we have to close now. But I think we really do want to thank Professor Miller for a fantastic lecture, so let's thank him again.